Prime Minister, but also if in anyone in my panel can just keep the time in the text channel, that would be fantastic. Gillian and Pratik.
Yeah, sure,
just
I can
using
do
phone. Yeah, fine, fantastic. So can I have the Prime Minister?
it.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are loud and clear.
My gender pronouns is she or her, and my PI preference is just through the chat. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The moment you start to commercialize spiritual wellness practices, the idea of commercialization is not how society benefits from the product itself, but how much profit you can get from the services of spiritual wellness practice without having to disappoint your consumers at the end. 3 points of setup before I move on to my arguments. First, what does commercialization looks like for the spiritual wellness practices? 3 points on this area. First, it is the over-glorification of spiritual wellness practices that if you are sick, just go meditate or use healing crystals, for example, for you to recover from your sickness itself. That comes from a company that sells products for spiritual wellness practices. But secondly, we see that companies using capitalistic methods to sway people into choosing spiritual wellness practices over medications, such as using marketing strategies to promote how good these products are to attract more consumers. And however, they also hinders the effectiveness of spiritual wellness practices, would be hindered by the financial gains itself. But thirdly, note that we're not opposing the whole idea of spiritual wellness practices. People can still co-opt into the practice as a last resort. We're just opposing the fact that these companies are using the practices itself and exploiting the idea of the whole culture for their own benefits only. Second point of setup is that if opposition concern is on how medical resources are still inaccessible for the people. Firstly, medical insurance, both publicly and privately, already exist in status quo, and governmental subsidies already exist for people to access, which mitigates the whole idea that medical resources are inaccessible to begin with. But secondly, we said that the more you commercialize spiritual wellness practices, you pragmatize the practice itself, which also makes it more inaccessible for people to utilize, right? Exactly because you're using it as a platform to gain more profits. If we were to talk about people from the lower middle class, the last resort that they opt into would also be closed off for access itself, exactly because of the financial gain that these companies want at the end. But thirdly, we don't think we should be talking about the culture preservation, just to be clear, because sure, spiritual wellness practices are based on indigenous cultures, but this debate should focus more on the commercialization of spiritual wellness practices, which is to say the promotion of these traditional practices and encourage more people to choose it over medication. But moving on to my arguments, I'm going to talk about why commercializing spiritual wellness practice is counterproductive for medical development. I'm going to explain this under a few layers. First, I have analysis on why medicines are the only platforms which we should focus on in school. The reason why medical standards are the ones which runs its status quo is because medicine is much more universal and much more safer for people to consume and for them to utilize to recover from their sickness itself. What does it look like? It looks like research is being done scientifically and specifically on the field itself to prove the efficacy of these medicines to begin with. The procedures before the implementation happens are explained explicitly for the people, for them to access these medication before the usage itself, right? And whether or not you can get the procedure that is applicable for the body, because notice how these medications are highly customized towards each and every individual who are going to consume these medicine at the end of the day, right? Comparatively under their side, exactly because they're using the commercialization for these spiritual wellness practices, what happens that company is only going to tell these people the positive view of the spiritual wellness beings, the spiritual wellness practices, and undermining all of the harms that people can get, such as the side effects or even the malpractices that could happen and whatnot, right? Especially in the context of pandemic running, which it is even more urgent for people to believe in medical standards instead of just opting into spiritual wellness practices. But if spiritual wellness practices are being commercialized in status quo, we say that they simply shift the spotlight on these practices instead, right? This is dangerous because when outbreaks happens again, when it's something that's unpredictable, you wouldn't want people to opt into spiritual wellness practices instead of medical standards instead, right? Because notice how under their side, people are going to be swayed by the company's marketing strategy, and they would go to local wellness spiritual industries instead. Even if we take it in their best case scenario where these medications are successful, however, it comes at the expense of a huge cost, which is going to be bad under two reasons. First, local spiritual industries are only capable of healing the generic diseases and not the severe diseases that people are going to have, right? We can see to the fact that spiritual wellness practices may be effective for some people, but if it works under the idea of a placebo effect, the efficacy stops at the degree where people believe in how effective these spiritual wellness practices works, right? So if for some people meditation is something that's effective to recover their diseases, then the placebo effect is going to be efficient for them to recover from the diseases itself. However, exactly because people don't have the same degree of beliefs and the same degree of beliefs towards these spiritual wellness practices, which is why the efficacy of the whole practice itself is going to be asymmetrical for how people are going to recover from their disease from the practice itself. However, now because there are different types of diseases and how some diseases are severe, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, people have to believe that if it cures a disease, even when it is not proven scientifically to be true, not even like there's not going to be enough of a guarantee that you get from spiritual wellness practices to help the people out. We don't want the commercialization to degrade the medication's value and over glorify the idea of the practice itself. But secondly, it's going to be bad because even if opposition was to argue that spiritual wellness practices can be developed with more funding, for example, the commercialization itself, we said at the moment it is developed until the extent where it is proven scientifically, it's not going to be a good preventive mechanism because most people already sacrifice their health instead for the usage of the spiritual wellness practice at the end, right? Because when all of these things when all of these things didn't have to happen, we said it's better if you don't commercialize the idea of spiritual wellness industry and up into medications instead. When commercialization foreshadows the real fact behind spiritual wellness practices, it's simply too good to be true that people are unable to reject the idea of spiritual wellness being itself, that people plain out reject the medication and how the value of medication is something that's even more that's proven more scientifically to be true. Second layer of analysis, we can talk about how it emboldens the stigma that spiritual wellness practice does actually work. We said this is especially dangerous for people who still uphold conservative beliefs when these people still don't believe in technologies and medications and the efficacy of it as a whole, right? Because notice how when you're commercializing the idea of spiritual wellness practices, you're simply affirming them that these traditional ways are the correct ways to heal people from the diseases that you're suffering instead, right? However, it's going to be worse on the other side when you commercialize the whole idea, because then you're emboldened the traditional ways instead of just going to hospitals and taking medical procedures that can actually help these people out. You can simply spread the words that companies are telling you how good these products are and these practices are that good because the advertisement you see in the media for example, right? These things are like these advertisements are what disrupts your view towards medication itself. If we take it at the worst case scenario, when spiritual wellness practice fails, people would simply shrug it off because they already have a fixed mindset that, oh, if it fails, it only fails one. Usually it always works because of how these companies are glorifying the idea of spiritual wellness being. The spiritual wellness practices. When it simply creates more resistance for people to go into medical institutions to seek for medication because of how good these people the things that they heard from spiritual wellness practices are that good, right? However, comparatively on our side, we said that the credibility is going to be much better if we use scientific medical procedures instead, right? As the medical institutions also provides a higher level of certainty that actually heals the people's sickness rather than just over glorifying and marketing the people suffering through the idea of the whole spiritual wellness, spiritual wellness practices itself, right? Because notice how when side effects still happen towards these people, if you use it as like a commercialization for you to gain your profits, it's also something that's unjustified because people don't actually heal from the practices of the spirit, like from these traditional culture itself. It is simply an exploitation of these indigenous cultures, which is why it's something that's not going to be efficient for people to recover from the diseases itself. If we're talking about serious issues such as the COVID-19 outbreak, for example, it's not going to be effective if people choose these spiritual wellness practices over legitimized medication, which is why we're so proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for the speech. Can I have the leader of the opposition to continue the debate?
Okay, give me 1 second just to set up my timer.
Cool.
Okay. Okay. My speech will start in 3, 2, Judge, before I get into my speech, let's note that this motion is a retrospective debate, meaning that if this has not factually happened in the past, you cannot claim it as a harm or as a benefit, which is exactly what Proposition's first speaker has done. Before I get into my speech, I'll just be going over the first speaker's points, and I'll be rebutting them and explaining why they are not true. Okay, let's start with their characterization. We think that their characterization is a bit odd of this, right? They assume that all spiritual wellness practices are like, if you are sick, go get a healing crystal. We do not think that it is limited to this, and we do not think that they can make the debate all about healing crystals. All right. Secondly, they told you that the characterization is that people lie to you about it, and they make them go there to go quote unquote fix their problems. Right. First, we simply even if this does happen, we don't think that people would sacrifice that thing that a company is telling you versus actual scientific proof, okay, which is exactly what has happened today. Therefore, their point is disregarded because the medicine it isn't actually true. This hasn't been proven that people actually go there, and if they do, they go there in conjunction with taking medicine. For example, if it doesn't work, presumably you will go to if you go there and then it doesn't work, it's not that you're just going to trust it forever just because the company told you so, right? It's not like you're gonna put all absolute faith in the company. We think that's just absurd for them to assume that. Okay, lastly, they talk about how you're exploiting the culture for their profit. We simply just don't think that's true. As we can see in today's world, a lot of them are treated respectfully. For example, yoga, and that's the main thing that I'll be talking about in my speech. All right, so let's go over their points quickly. Firstly, they tell you that people will choose it over medicine. All right, they tell you that the company is only going to tell the people about how good it is. For example, they won't tell you about the side effects, and that may be dangerous. Two responses to this. Firstly, we do not think that you're just going to absolutely trust the company from what you say. Obviously, you'll look at recommendations. If it doesn't work, that's true. But also, note that this is just simply not true. A lot of the reasons why this works is because it's a psychological thing. It's not a physical thing. People go there knowing that they will not get actual scientific medicine that cures them. They go there going for the psychological part because it's such thing as a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is why these work. So even if they do put absolute trust in the companies, it does work anyways. Also, let's talk about the side effects. What kind of side effects can you go if you just attend a place where they heal you with a crystal, right? We don't think it's anything to do such as like injecting like unknown medicine into your bloodstream. We do not think that the side effects are going to be that severe. All right. Secondly, they tell you that they won't go to medicine, but they tell you that they will choose these companies over the medicine, even if the medicine is already scientifically proven. Firstly, we just think that this is absurd. Obviously any normal human being would not choose this. We think that this is a mischaracterization of people in general. Note that however, we think the people who would do this are religious people, the people who believe in this kind of medication, right? These are the indigenous people. These are the people who created those cultures. We think those are the type of people who are more likely to go even if it doesn't work, right? We think that in that case, that's the religion and you can't stop them from doing that. All right, so note that we don't actually think that this argument has a lot of impact, even if it is true. All right, why? Because firstly, this is a retrospective debate, and we do not see many things on the news about people dying because they went to healing crystal practices. Okay, we just simply think that this can be disregarded. Also, note that this is one specific type, and we think that and even if it didn't work, it does give them peace of mind. It does help them. People who go there choose to go there because they think it will work. Okay, and most of the time it does, because as I already said, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? We do not see anything on the news saying that, oh, there was this big accident, so even if it doesn't work, it's not even that harmful. So let's just look, this argument falls because firstly, it's untrue. Secondly, this is a retrospective debate, and this isn't a lot about that. And lastly, it's just not very impactful. All right, now let me get into my speech. Let's start with some framing. Okay. So let's talk about what has happened in the past and what kind of world we are defending. This looks like setting up things like spiritual practices. This looks like how setting up spiritual practices came with an increase in learning about Indian culture. For example, especially in yoga, we see that today a lot of the yoga instructors do learn about the Indian cultures, and they are aware of what the words mean and what the spiritual connection is, right? So most instructors know nowadays, most of the people who do these spiritual wellness beings, even if it's healing crystals, they do know about the cultural purposes, right? They do things for example, in yoga, they play Indian music at the start of the lessons, right? They cannot claim cultural appropriation because it has actually been one of the only things that has been respectful, that the culture has still been learned about, the history has been taught, and it's still very respectful to to this day, right? So now let's talk about the yardstick and the burdens and what they needed to prove. They needed to prove that we were. So when do we regret things? We regret things when they have done more harm, and on the comparative, the world without this would have been better. They needed to prove that, and yet they did not. Okay, let's start with my first point about how access to the culture creates benefit. All right, so let's talk about the goal of the practices. In specific benefit to the indigenous people, the goal is to bring people happiness and to bring people good health and give them solace mind, right? So if more people can access, that is what they want, right? The traditional indigenous people do not want to just keep it to themselves. They want to spread their message, like many religions, for example, right? They do not want to keep it all to themselves, meaning that the fact that it has become more global is actually a good thing for them, right? So, okay. Secondly, it incentivizes with a commercialization. This has actually incentivized people to teach spiritual wellness. So, like, financially, this can be a job. They can be paid, which means that more people are incentivized to teach. Without financial incentive, why would you spread spiritual wellness? Like, oh, the only answer is your religion. And this is a very rare situation, and only very little have these incentives. Many people would not bother to do it unless they know they can earn money. For example, like only traditional Indian people would do it. That is very few. So on the comparative, this means that very few people will be exposed to these kind of things, right? So now let's talk about the benefits and why people need to be exposed. Firstly, it is generally good for people's mental health. When it is more accessible, more people can access it and more people can get access to their benefits. For example, yoga has been proven to help with stress, to help with mental health, to help you calm down. We think that this is a massive benefit that we get on our side, right? So yoga gives them like peace of mind and allows them to calm down. And this is a massive benefit. And now, due to the commercialization and because it is more widespread, it is no longer only Indians who can access this. This is everyone else. We think that this is a huge macro benefit that is unique to our side. So let me impact this quickly. On the comparative, why is it not popular? Firstly, they do not get the widespreadness that we do. The people teaching it on their side would be very little and would only be in India. This means that not everybody is able to reap the benefits. And secondly, the other reason why it is important, because the purpose of teaching this wellness is to spread the idea. All right, now let me quickly just brush over my second point about how you keep this alive. You keep alive the tradition. This is because right now, okay, two mechanisms. Firstly, that younger generations wouldn't have gotten involved in yoga, and secondly, how we want it to be, how it spread the culture. Let's start with the first one, why younger generations have not gotten involved in things like yoga, things like healing crystals that are very traditional, right? There's a global trend now that moves away from like these traditional practices, right? But now with the commercialization, it makes it so that it's not just old people who use it, but now young people can too. This means that the tradition does not die out, as I said earlier, because there's an incentive to become one of those instructors because you can now earn money. Secondly, we want this culture to be spread as it becomes more and more developed. Younger generations move away, but the rebranding of it from something that was very traditional to something like, but now they don't, because the rebranding of it and that they can make money from it, right? So it becomes something that will stay, meaning their culture does not die out. Like, the impact of this is that with the commercialization, their culture has not died out. These very important spiritual wellnesses have stayed. It has become a very important tradition to those people, and not only has it done that, but it has also created this big widespread benefit. So let me just sum up what I've told you today. Firstly, I've explained to you 2 points. One, to the benefit of people and the access of culture, and secondly, why we keep alive these traditions. And I've already taken down Proposition's point about how the medicine doesn't work, and therefore I think we should take this debate.
I thank the leader of the opposition for the speech. Can I have the DPM?
Hello, am I audible? Is it clear?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Give me a second. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think that opposition misrepresenting the true motions that we are talking about, because we are talking about the action of commercializing it, and the thing that we are regretting is about the action of commercializing the things that is not eventually really true based on scientific research. Like, we don't want to over glorify this kind of traditional medication, exactly because when you are commercializing it, meaning that the purpose of this medication is not to make for the people's benefits, to cure themselves, but also to gain as much as profit as possible. I think the opposition have to engage to what my PM stated on the characterization on why commercialization is a thing here that we want to regret. We don't ban you from doing yoga, but that misrepresentation on what yoga can do, and is the thing that we want to regret under ourselves. The responses for the opposition. Firstly, I think that exactly because I think that opposition have to consider why then people co-opt to trust the spiritual wellness from the first place to begin with, right? Because I think that when people believe that traditional values, exactly because there is not scientific research in it, exactly because then people believe on those kind of traditional values. For example, when they involve some kind of spirits, for example, that is not inherently true based on scientific research to help you. For example, you cannot rely on placebo effect to like cure your cancer, for example, or like any physical features that helps you in the first place. It's just not inclusive for opposition. It only works in certain contexts. Second of all, I think that the problem here is that when you are commercializing the purpose, the medication itself from the first place, right? Because I think that exactly because people are heavily reliant on placebo effect, exactly because under LO told you that there is a big incentive for you to like even commercialize this kind of things, that it's not the true meaning of the spiritual wellness in the end of the day, because you are trying to get as much as profit as possible. You are complying to the debt incentive for you to even to commercialize this thing from the first place to begin with. That is why within that placebo effect will become even much more worsened to the extent when you are hampering down the physical or the medical medication in the future, exactly because when you are being framed and being sugarcoated by the companies, when you think that this is the only way for you to medicate yourself, that is when the thing become worsened by in itself using commercialization. But second of all, I didn't think that commercialization is really that important under opposition world, right? Because if they want to talk about the benefit of spiritual wellness, we don't ban them from doing spiritual wellness. But the thing is, we don't want to commercialize it because it can hamper down any other options for you to medicate yourself in the first place. It's just complying to the stigma of traditional values. And I told you before, I told you after, why winning is gonna be even much more worse in the future. I think that because of these things, I don't think that opposition states about telling you why the benefits it also can be exclusively under their side happen symmetrically under both sides, because I think that we don't ban the whole idea of the traditional wellness. You can still do it, but we don't want to commercialize, and even to the extent when people truly believe that is the one thing for you to like medicate yourself at the end of the day. Going to my constructive, I told you why it emboldens the traditional values and why it's worsened in the pragmatical view. But second of all, why we think that medication still can be better under our side anyways. So first of all, I think in some countries, exactly because they heavily rely on to this cultural values from the first place, it's blockading the likelihood for them to look at the other perspective or other alternatives. Like for example, when you are heavily reliant to your traditional values, you are heavily reliant to those indigenous values, for example, from the first place. Exactly, because then you already believe those kind of values, but now even companies are commercializing those good and angelic corporations are going to confirm your bias on those kind of medications from the first place to begin with, right? But yeah, going to my point, why do you think this is worse than under their side? Because first of all, I think that you have a hard time as a government to supporting the welfare system. Because when we talk about welfare systems that exist in the status quo, it's just mostly impossible for government to be relied on those placebo effect and those traditional values and even funding more spiritual wellness under their side anyways, right? Because we think that the system that exists in the status quo is that the government rely more on the healthcare, for example, to health worker, for example, more hospital, more healthcare institution that is based on scientific research and not based on traditional values. I think that when that is kind of problem, when people think and only think there is only one way for you to medicate yourself, this is where the things from medication even much more worsen, because you don't rely and you don't trust more about medical medication, you trust more about doing yoga, for example, under their side. This is where the subsidization of welfare under government side of the house will be hampered down, exactly because people tend to go more to these traditional values instead of those medical medication in the status quo. I think it's also unfair because the context here, we are not in this talking of context of belief. We don't think that every single person have that kind that same kind of perception toward this traditional belief. That means that government will be more harder to comply to every single individual's welfare, exactly because people have their own interpretation on how they would medicate themselves from the first place. But second of all, I think it's also undermining all the practical research that already been done throughout history, like panels, because we think that if you want to glorify the spiritual wellness, even more commercializing it, exactly because you have the incentivizing it, you're undermining the degrees and every research that people are doing from those kind of centuries. For example, when people's health already can have a hard time searching for how to cure cancer, for example, or to make antidotes for a virus will be undermining under their side, exactly because you rely more to evil spirits, for example, no thank you for spirits, for example, and traditional belief instead of more research that is based on people's hard work. I don't think that's principally justified under their side, even if in a certain extent I don't understand how commercialization leads to benefits under their side. Second of all, I think in certain nuance is gonna be hampered down under their side, right? Because we think that there is certain illness that needs specific medical medication, for example, like when you need operation, for example, or other like professional rehabilitation. We're talking about mental illness and stuff. It's gonna be hampered down under their side, because when you are regarding to this kind of issues, people tend under the context of traditional belief, I think that people tend to underestimate the real problems that exist in status quo, because they frame it as evil spirit that possess you, for example, that something that is abstract, for example, that possess you, instead of focusing to the real problems that exist for the individuals individuals itself in the first place. I think that this process will be even hampered down under their side, exactly because you don't like go to more more scientific researchers that based on true proof instead of you relying to those like ways to get away those evil spirits instead. Then this procedure will be even much more worsened under their side. Second of all, I think that even if you have those over glorification of this medical illness, it's also going to comply to the stigma. For example, when people condemn certain people because they see these people inherit certain evil spirit, for example, just because they behave certain way, because there is not the thing that is true on the first place to begin with. Second of all, why we think that medication will be even better under our side? Because first of all, placebo effects and those kind of effects still exist on our side, right? Because when the moment you see the doctors, for example, when you are believing in more medication, in more scientifically proven medication, you are not just trusting that doctors will save you, but also the actual benefits can also save you in the future anyways, right? Because you can improve your condition because you trust the antidotes can help you, and the antidotes is provenly scientifically proven will help you anyways in the future. So I don't think that the physical I don't think that those kind of benefit is extremely exclusive under opposition anyways. The thing is, it still can happen under opposition world, but what differentiates us from opposition is that when you trust this kind of spiritual things, you don't, this kind of benefit, this kind of narrative will be hindered upon under opposition's words. That is why under those reasons, we say that physical medication shouldn't be hindered upon, and that is why action of commercialization leads to more harms brought to
I thank the TPM for the speech. Can I have the DLO?
Yep. I'd like my POIs to be done verbally. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, cool. My time starts in 3, 2, 1. Prof is essentially being extremely uncharitable about what cultural practices entail and how people would use this based on a bunch of assertions and odd characterizations that I'll later bring down one by one. So no, Prof, this motion isn't only about the minimal exaggerated practices. And so far, we've only seen like one main point brought for them about the medical, which has already been sufficiently taken down by PM, but by our first speaker, but why not bring that down again? Okay, so first they said you put a price tag on culture. So we don't see any impact of this argument, but instead, if you flip this for our side, now these cultures can earn money. This looks like Indonesian yoga coaches earning more money, people spreading this earning more money, and it gives them more incentives to do so. But also people practicing these in their traditional countries want this to be spread out of their culture. So for people to appreciate this and practice this outside of their country, and therefore we fulfill this purpose on op that is mutually exclusive to us. But also they said on points of cultural appropriation and how you change aspects of it. First, this isn't true. People have incentives to keep it as exotic as possible, as it is a big selling point of these type of rituals. You see Western people being like, oh, look at these fresh different crystals I got from different countries. This is appealing to them as it feels like they're trying new things. So therefore, Prop has mischaracterized this commercialization, which would actually look like making it more mainstream in its original form. So this takes down Prop's point sufficiently. However, even if this was true, we would be willing to make this trade-off because at least these traditions are being kept alive, and people spreading these traditions are economically benefiting off of this on our side, and the health benefits on users outweigh everything else, right? So they've also said that it's not how much society can benefit from it, but how much money can be made out of it. So this is the case with everything that's commercially available. Prop needs to show that this profit incentive has actively caused harm that would not exist otherwise, which we don't get at all. But in fact, this money-making incentive has led to the spread of these good practices leading to concrete benefit, which I'll explain later. Now, on their point of over glorification of spiritual well-being, if you're sick, you don't go to medication, but crystals, which is, let me point out, this is their worst case scenario, and actually the only scenario that they've said. Take note that they didn't engage with any of our rightly characterized benefits of this wellness at all. So now to refute this, there are already regulations in place to prevent the most exaggerated of claims. Advertisers cannot simply make up lies and people can think for themselves. This isn't a problem inherent to commercialization. There will always be people who doubt modern medicine for various reasons. Maybe they turn up to spiritual well-being as an alternative now, but if it wasn't for commercialized, people would just find other things to fill the void, which our first speaker has stated, which is more harmful because there are bigger side effects. Prop doesn't do anything to stop this either, whereas on our side, with more commercialization, people have more discourse about this, about the origins and the true uses, which are actually stated and learned rather than exaggerations. We see that op solves this problem more. Therefore, we feel like we've sufficiently taken this point too. But also, PM has only argued on a specific of these practices like crystals, whereas on our side, we get a wide range of benefits that outweigh these minimal potential harms, like yoga significantly proven to help with mental and physical health. We don't see how people would just turn to yoga when they have cancer instead of actual medicine. This is just a mischaracterization and it's just absurd coming from them. So now back into my case. We get incentives for more people to get into it. So how does this commercialization help these practices become more mainstream? Because more people learn about it due to the presence of advertising, it being more widely available and consumed. Producers have incentives to make sure it is spread to as much people as possible. Previously, these practices were seen as strange or superstitious, but now they can be repackaged and sold in a way that is more familiar or appealing to them. And this impact is unique to commercialization because we see breakdowns of stereotypes as these producers would have economic incentives to make sure these practices would be seen as normalized and made as understandable to as many people as possible, which therefore brings down DPM's absurd point on how we get more stereotypes. This is just counterproductive to their side. But also that spiritual wellness is inherently good for people, and it's when it's made more accessible due to people wanting to get into this and planning practices. So we therefore see mental health benefits like yoga being scientifically proven. So it's not like this is just some fake news. And two, even if it doesn't, and it's things like crystals, we believe that this is still okay because it lets people think positively and have hope in their life, especially in like lower income countries, conflict-ridden countries, in these like culturally rich places. For example, this looks like dream catchers, evil eyes, giving people comfort and letting them sleep comfortably at night. So basically, we aren't here to argue whether it works or not, even though it is scientifically proven in most cases. But as long as it reaps the benefits and people are happier, we're happy to make this trade-off. But also, it has a benefit of allowing more people to access these traditions and a benefit of spiritual wellness, as commercializing makes it more affordable for everyone. And mental health is not just something rich people can therefore achieve, which is also directly clashes against DPM's point and PM's point on how it makes it more expensive for people. We don't see this as true on their side. So first, this looks like no longer needing to fly to this country to be able to experience this stuff to improve your mental health or experience this and learn about the origins. But also what happens with commercialization is that's more widely available because mass production leads to more products and more producers. So a wider choice of this, and economies of scale leads to lower cost. So commercializing itself is not inherently problematic. As everything nowadays has a price, we're just lowering the price and basically in status quo, you won't get anything for free anyways. And with spiritual well-being practices, there's actually less risk of harms of commercialization, like child labor or poor working conditions, because there's a growing focus on purity of the origin of the product that's inherent to it. And this is an important characteristic, as this type of exploitation will maybe always be a problem, but we get less of this on our side. So these indigenous people are made more financially able, so it's less likely to them giving into being exploited. Consumers and spiritual well-being caring more likely about the origins of the product, as previously stated. Also, if you're an indigenous tribe, you can always commercialize this your own practices. You can sell it, bring people in for tours to experience these practices. It's not always third-party issue of exploitation, which is just an assertion from Prop. But lastly, people wanting to keep these traditions alive, right? So the importance of tradition, as the first speaker stated, is more cultures westernizing. As more cultures are westernizing and modernizing, it is inherent and paramount that these cultures spread so it doesn't die out. These cultures die out as these traditions don't go through or across borders, and it's less likely to stay in these countries that are easily dominated by newer, more Western cultures. So the best way to keep it alive is through commercializing, as we said just now, economic benefits, incentives, as these producers are more likely to want to spread it to as many people as possible to get this financial benefit. But also on the extension of stakeholders of indigenous tribes and groups in America that used to live in these cultures, for example, and conduct nature rituals, but are pushed out of their habitat and back into the city, as we see in status quo now. First, prop doesn't do anything to help this. They're just leaving them to rot, having nowhere to live. But two, you don't allow them to do the practices where they're used to it. So completely their culture being more and more wiped out, as you can see, prop not doing anything and just enabling this to happen. But on our side, by commercializing, first of all, you help people realize how important it is to preserve these practices, as people are actually aware of these practices and the importance of culture and how it can actually benefit them in the first place, as you give more people access to it, and to economic incentives for people to continue their tradition, as they can therefore make money off of teaching people how to do things like nature rituals through tourism and more, instead of moving to more modernizing Western means. So therefore, this also looks like government having incentives to make sure that these indigenous people are protected, as they're now seen as a valuable member of the productive society, and that they can actually benefit to the economy hugely through tourism. So the impact of this is that it keeps cultures and traditions alive, because it keeps cultural heritage, gives people a sense of identity, and you therefore help people to remember where they came from. So therefore, with all these points, we've taken down mostly all of prop's, only prop's points, and given how we have exclusive benefits to our side and how prop doesn't do anything to actively solve problem, whereas op does. Therefore, this motion must and will fall. Thank you.
Time the dialogue and have a go with. Go with.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Is my sound a bit small or?
Yeah, your sound is a bit low. It would be great if you speak a bit louder.
How about now? Is it okay?
Yeah, it's hearable.
Okay.
You can start whenever you're ready.
Okay, sure. For POS, I would just accept POS from chat because I won't be accepting verbal POS. Okay. Okay, going to start. Wait, let me drink first. Going to start in 3, 2, 1. Monetizing indigenous culture and misportraying it as unjustifiable. To the extent that you're keeping money for yourselves, companies are not giving incentives for minorities itself. Furthermore, I think that opposition try to do the impossible thing here. It's to rebut the whole context on capitalism, saying that companies are not money oriented. I think that they have zero response on this. I think that this context is what has the highest threshold in this debate. It is more likely like Rachel and Aaron has already explained that to me. I think several points of framing to this debate. First, the op try to shift our case. I don't think that they can say that they that we are regretting our traditions and cultures and indigenous cultures. That Proud opposes the point of aggressive branding and marketing, not a spiritual wellness as a whole in itself. This is just a whole strawman that is coming from our. I think that this is not conflict in this debate. Secondly, they dodge the trade-off in this debate. If society is well conscious about fake spiritual things, you get less activity, less market activity in the market. If people are following the trend, which means people are less aware, you get companies competing with the rational pragmatic healthcare systems. Companies are using high-end marketing to just blindside people with fake information and fake researches, for example. I think that's like two questions in this debate. Firstly, is commercialization culpable in general? Second, does this bring benefits for the society, mainly in medications and the well-being of the people, especially indigenous culture? I'm going to talk about that in the second clash. Then our first clash is this is commercialization culpable in general? Yes, it does. It backslaps and outshadows the general healthcare system. For this, you get economical benefit. The reason to this is how how people on the ground get a better satisfaction with their care when buying high margin spiritual wellness products rather than the more credible alternative, that is the more trustable pragmatic medications. First analysis that opposition try to argue is that first, society is trustable, therefore people have a better perception and already have a self-consciousness on buying the product. I think that first response, society isn't well conscious. I don't think OP could say that society are well aware on this. Sure, they are aware on this, even if they are aware of this, but more likely is if it isn't working, the companies would convince people, like if the products aren't working, the companies would just convince people to buy more of the products rather than just like lose trust. I think that furthermore, the research like credible research on the products, like credible research are outshadowed by these companies' marketing, and capitalist companies are blindsiding people to buy their products. Therefore, this outshadows this blindsides people to give like fake information for the company simply because all they want is profit, right? This is crucial context because what these companies want are profits, and stealing people's money for like high margin products. That isn't unjustifiable. Second response, even if society is well conscious about the fake things that you buy, up doesn't get the benefit of sharing their culture, right? Simply buying it is deemed if you're buying it is deemed useless, then up you don't get promotions this bit. Don't get you don't get mass like products this bit. If you don't have, then companies are going to fail to sell their products. If they fail to sell their products, they're more likely they're just going to make more aggressive marketing. This is the context that you're going to have. This is not work. This is not worst case because this is the nature of the companies itself. I'm not being worst case here because I'm being super nice to their very best case, to their best case scenario, that is even if people are well conscious in this debate. What is more likely to happen here, and this way I'm going to be super nice here. First things first, even if people are well aware and won't buy the products for the second time, you get companies continuously making new trends to increase their profits and financial gains. You get more companies making diverse products, making it misrepresenting the culture and itself. Secondly, if society isn't well aware, you get companies utilizing if society isn't well aware, you get companies utilizing the people to get more high margins and profit. Therefore, you make companies making like unethical things, such as making factories in developing countries, child abuse, like how forced labor are going to be far way worse. You're going to have companies like cutting down the process and the cost to make something right. But what is the conclusion here? The conclusion here is either way, companies are creating more efforts to make their way to sell more products. Therefore, I think that commercialization, this is the exclusive harm to commercialization, because society cannot always be rational all the time. Therefore, companies are going to attack societies, making societies tempting to buy these products in the end of the day. Even if they buy products and placebo effect in return is going to exist on their side, since this is not like we're talking about the context here. Worst case is you're going to have people self-diagnose, making themselves experts and saying that this medication is better than the general medication that you get at a hospital. I think that the weighing here is when you have commercialization happen, you get continuous marketing from these companies. Like these companies are attacking people by giving them marketing, convincing the people to get marketing themselves. Therefore, if you don't have, this is the exclusive part because you don't have this without commercialization. Spiritual wellness still exists on our side, but it is just what like spiritual wellness systems are not going to be commercialized simply because they themselves are having indigenous people like sharing and preservation is two different things. I'm going to go through second class talking about that. Second class shit benefits and a better is about the benefits and a better medication for people. First analysis they say that cultural preservation is important. I think that first response of this is that opposition makes it worse. Why is it so? There's a difference between spreading indigenous culture that is distorted and is served to a potable way in society in comparison to like proper cultural preservations created by the government, incentivizing them to have culture construction. Two reasons here why is it different. Firstly, when you share indigenous culture, you need to simplify it and make it more palatable to society. You have no consent, and like you need to like make oversimplify the culture that is in the indigenous culture so that you could like give make it like very interesting for society in itself, right? This leads to misrepresentation happening on itself. I think that this misrepresentation in itself is non-consent, like there's no consent on marketing itself by the indigenous society and the culture inherent itself. I think that further on this is how you're going to make it unjustifiable to just steal someone's culture and make it as marketing and to get profits. For example, I think that second reason why this is harmful is that companies are keeping their money in their wallets. You still have mass discrimination and exploitation being ignored. This looks like you being like preserving like you sharing cultures on Amazonians, but there's still like the government is still discriminating them, cutting their forests down. I think that what is the reason behind this? Third reason is mass production is exploitative. If marketing is better, you're going to have mass production that is way worse on your side. I think for that would for
I think the speaker can have the next speaker.
Sorry, let me just set up my timer quickly. Okay, sorry, give me a second. Okay, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, it was proposition's burden to prove why specifically the commercialization of spiritual wellness practices has been bad. It was proposition's burden to prove why retrospectively these spiritual wellness practices have created more harms. It is proposition's burden to defend a world where these traditions die out and cultures fade. They have not done any of this. Where the tension lies in their case is when they come up and tell us why spiritual practices are so bad, but then right in the next sentence, they tell us that they wouldn't do anything to stop it. If it's so bad and people are dropping dead because they're using crystals instead of going to hospitals, then why are they continuing it? Why are they allowing indigenous people to continue to practice these things? If they tell us in the beginning they wouldn't mind people doing this, then why if it's so bad? This is one major tension in their case, and it's one reason why side opposition takes this debate by a mile. I'll be addressing two clashes in my debate. Firstly, the wider benefit on society, and secondly, the effect on indigenous people. Okay, essentially, what did we say in our case? So, okay, we feel like this has been severely mischaracterized on what commercialization actually looks like. What we've told you is we think that it's much more likely that commercialization looks like the creation of like yoga instructors, right? Creation of like yoga retreats, where it's something like that can be profited off for financial gain, right? It doesn't look like people, like companies hiding the like so-called dangers of yoga, which again, we're not sure what the dangers of yoga is. Like they haven't shown us what they are, but we also don't think it looks like the glorification of it, where they're essentially denying hospital care to go for it, right? But I'll be addressing that a little later. But what we've told you is that these things are actually good, right? Medication and yoga, like just drifting away from the extreme cases for 1 second, just like these have scientifically proven to be beneficial, right? To calm people down. And the widespread of it has had so many benefits on society, right? Okay, but what have we heard from them, right? So essentially what they've said in response is that people choose it over that people will choose like these crystals or whatever over medication because of marketing, and they don't learn about the side effects. Okay, I think we've dismantled the side effects problem pretty well already. So let's just 3 responses to this. Firstly, this is a retrospective debate. So let's just put an end to like this like ridiculous thing of what's happened, and let's just focus on what has happened, right? We think that people aren't like, if they have cancer, they're not like, oh, let me buy a crystal and I'm not going to get any like therapy for anything, right? We don't think this is realistic at all. What we think has happened is that people have maybe used it in conjunction, right? Like there's just like a simply like a missing link here, right? And like but also we think that if it doesn't work for someone, they will drop it eventually. Like we think that if someone like maybe like does yoga and they don't feel relaxed at all but just like uncomfortable, they won't do it, right? We really don't see why like this is so harmful to them. But also please note that we're talking about spiritual things. We're not talking about like physical ailments, right? Which is the type of medication that proposition is talking about in regards to sicknesses. But okay, panel, please, you cannot allow side proposition to just strawman us and claim that people are dropping dead because they're rubbing crystals instead of going to hospitals for cancer treatment. Just simply unrealistic. But let's just be like extremely charitable in this case. Like even if people refuse to use modern medicine, who will these people be? Well, we think they're most likely going to be people who hold these religious beliefs very dear to them, not because a company told them that they should, but just because it's inherently like they identify with it so much. This means that all the harms they claim on our side are likely to happen on their side too, because people would still follow these spiritual beliefs with or without the commercialization, which is what we're debating about. Okay, and okay, so essentially, what is the impact of this clash? Well, side proposition's case was basically based entirely on this. So when we prove that these spiritual practices have helped people, we automatically are a mile ahead of proposition. But regarding the second clash, and how does it affect these indigenous people? So what if we told you that we've told you like, what essentially do these indigenous people want? Well, essentially, we think that they want to spread their culture to spread, right? They don't want to see their culture die out, right? And the commercialization has had the exclusive benefit of making it accessible to the wider population and keeping the culture alive, right? We give 3 layers of analysis to this. Firstly, without the financial incentive, you only have the religious incentive, which we think is an extremely slim minority. And like, for example, in the case of yoga, it was very unlikely that it would have come out of India because there are not many outside in other countries, right? And this will lead to like the slow death of it, especially with the global trend of younger generations going away from it. So second layer of analysis, why does commercialization help with this? Because the rebranding of it from something that is very traditional to something that young people do while still keeping it respectful, still keeping like the underlying messages of it is what has caused the wide accessibility of it, right? Because and we think this is like, again, retrospective debate. We think this is prevalent in society. Like when yoga teachers teach like the historical significance of some poses, when they like play like some traditional Indian music in the background of these classes to calm people down. Like we think that the reason so many people like these things is because there's so much historical significance to these things, right? And then thirdly, in regards to the economic benefit that these indigenous people receive from it, now when you get the commercialization of it, yoga instructors in India can now profit off like teaching these things, right? They can now like get a living off these things. We think that this simply helps indigenous people. We do not see why this is harmful. But like on the counterfactual, what would happen in their side of the world? In their world, well, people who would be teaching this on a comparative level would be so little, right? And that would like only be in countries where this originally sprung up, right? This would mean that not everyone is able to reap the benefits, and eventually it would sell out. So what have we heard from them. Well, okay. So essentially what we've heard is that it no longer becomes like companies have the financial incentive. So it no longer becomes about spreading it, but about getting money. And then they also tried in third speaker to bring up this point about how it misrepresents the culture and it somehow leads to child labor. Okay, let's first tackle child labor because this was just we just simply reject all the premises of this. So essentially we don't think that exploiting it labor is not the purpose of these traditional practices, right? Like producers will care about this because the whole point of these practices is for cleanliness, holiness, etc., right? Even if they don't, right? Consumers will care about this because for them crystals is to make them feel good, like psychologically. So obviously a consumer wouldn't like it if children have been putting their lives at risk for picking out these materials. This point from prop simply does not make sense. But let's just take a look at the logic of their argument. Their logic is that if you as a person would believe a company over science and experiences, we think that this is absolutely absurd and they cannot claim this as a benefit because it is simply illogical. But then they also bring up this thing about misrepresenting the culture. Well, we've already explained to you the message isn't diluted. Why? Well, okay, firstly, this is a retrospective debate, as you've brought up millions of times, right? These like we've given you countless of examples, like how yoga instructors like they literally study it to understand the like historical significance of it, and like the reason these things are so special is because of the profound history that it has. It makes no sense for these companies to take it away, and we don't think they have taken it away. But then essentially we also bring you like the trade-off in their best case scenario. Like they're like what we're trying to tell you is that they deny the they try to tell us that we're denying the fact that companies aren't money oriented. But that is our exact point, is that they are money oriented. So they will spread the culture, and at least on our side of the house this culture exists. They don't seem to understand, or at least haven't engaged with the fact that their alternative is not having these cultures in the first place, them dying out. If it isn't profitable, if it wasn't commercialized, it wouldn't spread, which is why we're so proud to oppose. Thank you.
I can be off it. Can I have the reply?
Okay, give me 1 second.
You are a bit low. I think you can speak a bit harder.
Am I audible? Do I need to make my
Yeah.
volume louder? Oh, okay.
Yeah, you are now.
Is this better now? The volume?
Yeah, it's completely fine.
All right, thank you. Okay, give me 1 minute. Okay. Okay, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Judge, proposition has started off this debate, and they throughout their 3 speeches, in none of them have they been able to fulfill their burden. Their burden was to prove a comparative and why that was better. They never give us any explanation as to what their world actually looks like. They never give us any analysis as to why that is better, and they only talk about certain quote-unquote certain harms that aren't even realistic that would happen maybe in our world. All right? Down the bench, we have told you multiple times about firstly why they don't exist, secondly why they are too extreme, and thirdly why they are just unreasonable to assume that people have done this, alright? We simply just don't think that any of their points at the end of the day stand due to the fact that we have responded them down the bench. And even if they did, they have never proved to us why their world is any better. They never explain their comparative, which makes it impossible for them to take this debate. In this speech, I'll be doing 2 things. Firstly, I'll be going through their case and explaining their 3 main points and why they do not stand at the end of the day. Secondly, I will be going through how they have not responded to some of our core ideas and why they still stand. And thirdly, I will be going through their strategic errors and why it makes it impossible for them to win. Let's start with their case. Firstly, they spend most of their first 2 speeches talking about medicine and how people will not take it due to the commercialization. But down the bench, we have already told you 3 responses to this. Firstly, this is extremely unrealistic. Maybe at best they would do it in conjunction with Western medicine, right? And we also told you if it doesn't work, why would they keep doing it? We don't understand why you would trust a company over your own personal experience, or why you would trust a company over the World Health Organization. We simply think think that this is not true. Secondly, we told you that this is a spiritual thing. When you are using the healing crystals, you are aware that it is based on the placebo effect and that it's not scientifically proven. People go here aware of what might happen. They are aware of the kind of treatment they are receiving. Therefore, they are aware of all these harms. So lastly, we already told you that the harm is not great enough even if this does happen. Let's talk about their second point, about how companies are profit driven. Our response to this is simply like we responded to this multiple times and they never actually explain why this is important, all right? Why is it important that these companies are profit driven? So what if the companies are profit driven? We think that they are, as long as they're actually respectful, which we have proved to you multiple times. Secondly, and that they are still spreading the tradition and keeping it alive. These are two benefits that we get on our side that they never respond to. I don't care whether or not this company is profit driven. I only care that the indigenous people can still have their traditions to this day. We think that's just so much more important. Lastly, in their last speech, they bring you this quick one-liner about misrepresentation. Okay, so our response to this is simply, friend, first we told you we already framed this out of debate. Let's look at the retrospective and how it's actually manifested in today's society. We see that yoga and those kind of things are very respected. People learn about the past in Indian culture. They do not culturally appropriate this. This is one of the rare things that has happened, right? So it's just simply factually untrue. But secondly, even if we did bite to the bullet here, this is they tell us this response way too late in the debate for you to credit it. We think that if they wanted to run misrepresentation, it should have come up in first, but it did not, which therefore means it's not as important. Let's talk about our case. We told you that we keep this alive, we keep this thing respectful, and thirdly, you have a greater benefit. And lastly, we told you that indigenous people can receive an economic benefit, and that they can now pursue their religion without worrying whether or not they can buy food. They don't give us adequate analysis as to why all of these things do not happen on our side or are better on their side. As I told you, they don't give us a comparative. We tell you why these are specific to our side. They don't respond to this. This is a strategic error that makes it impossible for them to win this debate. So let me just sum up what proposition has done in this debate. Firstly, their strategic errors are, firstly, they live in the extreme. Secondly, they did not engage with the crux of our case until way too late in the debate, and even then it was way too underanalyzed, and we already took that down. Thirdly, they have not impacted their arguments and explained to us why this is enough to regret the commercialization of this. And they have also, fourthly, they have not made it specific to commercialization. They've made it specific to the practices in general. And lastly, they do not have a comparative which is necessary for them to win. Judge, I think your only choice is opposition.
I think the upper plus speaker. Can I have the upper plus speaker?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Opposition can win this debate if they only share your definition of commercialization. When Op conceded that companies' intention was financial profit, preservation would happen on their side. But even if it does happen, it's only a misrepresentation of the indigenous culture at the end of the day. Two clashes to sum up this debate. First, on cultural preservation, and second, whether the commercialization is regrettable or not. But on the first clash, on cultural preservation, right? We said that this debate was never on cultural sustainability, rather on the effectivity on the medical field for the survivability of the people themselves. LO never explains why cultural sustainability assists survivability when it occurs on the idea of capitalism instead. But even if it is true that cultural preservation is so important, their first premise is very bizarre. Preservation through economic gains is not going to be the whole idea and the whole mechanism that preserves the whole culture at the end, because of two reasons. First, this directly refers to our case talking about how there are misrepresentation of the culture itself, because instead of preserving the culture, you focus on how much financial profit you can get for these companies instead, right? But secondly, you even question why it's okay to capitalize people's sickness for your own economic gain. We told you that these simply compromise medication efficacy. That economic gain that you want will never manifest to the fullest extent. No engagement from proposition. But even if you want to, even if you are you're so charitable towards these indigenous culture, we question yourself the house, why does preservation needs to be through commercialization itself, right? Because firstly, tradition is never the main priority that you want to protect under yours of the house. because on your side, if you want tradition, sure, you get tradition, but at the expense of people dying instead, right? It's going to put people to demonize the rigidity of the tradition itself due to their consistent declining on medical, like modern scientific medical procedure to cure complex diseases. But secondly, if anything that indigenous people care about is the preservation of spiritual wellness practice, not the financial benefit that you can get from these practices itself. Misrepresentation of traditional culture does happen on their side. These companies can only frame these culture in a way that society would accept and not what the culture is actually about. But thirdly, even if this represents, even if the cultural preservation is important, on our side, we think that this claim is not going to be something that's exclusive under their side, right? Because the claim is still going to be there anyway. Because like we're not banning the idea of spiritual wellness practices. Rather, we're only regretting the idea of the commercialization itself. When these companies they only exploit the idea of the culture itself for their own economical gain, right? Local wellness industries, they can still run. We're just not putting them inside the utmost priority for the commercialization itself. Their benefit is not even exclusive, but it's better if we don't capitalize the culture itself. The second question on whether the commercialization is regrettable or not. We said a spiritual wellness practice works under the idea of placebo effect. Opposition come up to this debate generalizing that every person has the same belief that doing yoga can cure your mental health issues. This is why they lose this debate because of three reasons. First, exactly because spiritual wellness practice only works spiritually, physical unwellness cannot be cured under the house, right? Because commercialization will simply create a false perception that if you rely on a crystal or you rely on yoga, it can cure COVID-19 or even cure cancer, for example, right? It doesn't make any sense that opposition only talks about mental well-being when there's no engagement towards what we told you, just severe diseases that actually happens in status quo, right? But secondly, they try to told you that if people are not that irrational to only opt for yoga instead, right? Because however, this directly kills their own case because if people don't like choose yoga over medication, therefore all of their benefits about how these all of their benefits about cultural preservation can be relevant instead. But secondly, they also comply with the stigma and status quo that spiritual wellness practice is the only way to cure all the diseases, and it's exactly what's very dangerous under their side because then people would choose these spiritual wellness practices instead of medication instead. The moment you don't believe in the practices that much, is when the effect of the placebo is not going to be as well towards you, and the benefits of the yoga or even the crystal itself is not going to be provided towards you instead. Exactly because people undermine the real problem, which is the underdeveloped medicine itself. Under their side, these problems become even more exacerbated. Exactly because you don't have these people focusing more on the conventional ways of medication. Instead, you opt into spiritual wellness practices instead. And exactly because of that, we're so proud to propose. Thank you.
I think the comment replace speaker for the speech, and here it concludes the debate. So thank you guys for the debate. So you guys will get the results afterwards in the main room.